Hello and welcome to Our Stories and Ourselves, a podcast about how our minds make stories and stories make us. My name is Kirsty, and in this show I talk about the stories we tell ourselves about the world, the stories we tell ourselves about history, and about how the way we think shapes these stories and shapes us. Today, I'm going to talk about the impact that fiction can have on reality. When I graduated university, my parents gave me a book called Books That Changed the World, the 50 most influential books in human history. Many of the books listed are non-fiction, from the obvious ones like On the Origin of Species and The Communist Manifesto, to the less immediately obvious, but ones that make sense in retrospect, like The Phone Book. However, it also included many fiction books which have had an impact on the world for various reasons. There are many similar lists floating around the internet, no two of which seem to fully agree, but there are usually some overlaps. The relationship between fiction and fact is an interesting one. To get a bit meta, if off on a slight tangent, which will come back around, I usually end the show with a quote. However, I've been struggling to find accurately attributed quotes for the show. So when I found a quote for this episode, I went to Quote Investigator to find out if Mark Twain had really said, "Truth is stranger than fiction, but it is because fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities. Truth isn't." It does sound quite Twain-like, but can we be sure? Thankfully, this is one of the many quotes that the Quote Investigator has delved into. It turns out that yes, it was Mark Twain, in that very wording. Yet it's not the full story. It turns out Lord Byron wrote a similar sentiment, at least to the first half of the quote, in 1823. To quote, "'Tis strange, but true, for truth is always strange. Stranger than fiction, if it could be told. How much would novels gain by the exchange? How differently the world would men behold." End quote. But it does look like the truth is stranger than fiction because fiction has to be believable, comes from Twain. If you're not familiar with it, the Quote Investigator is a website run by Garson O'Toole, who very thoroughly digs into the origins of famous quotes. It's definitely worth a visit, and I've linked it on the resources page and in the show notes. One thing I noticed while going down a quote rabbit hole is that often the reality of a quote is not the most famous, pithy version. For example, another quote attributed to Mark Twain is that a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth can get its boots on. The Quote Investigator didn't find any evidence that Twain had ever said that, but there are many versions of the sentiment. The earliest is from Jonathan Swift, who, in 1710, said, "Falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it." From there are many variations of the idea, which developed. Writers built on the work of those who went before, but also the idea has a strength between any one person. Again, do go and read the Quote Investigator page, it's really interesting. Also interesting is that the quote is often attributed to Terry Pratchett, one for the Our Stories and Ourselves bingo card there, as he used it in the plot point in his novel, The Truth. It long predates him, but it's interesting that it fits so well in the story he was telling that people assume he came up with it. So it seems like sometimes an idea goes through several iterations, from the person who is first recorded as writing or saying it, to the most pared down, pithy version that gets put on pretty backgrounds and shared around the internet with unreliable attributions. It's interesting that often the pretty internet quote doesn't really have a true attribution, because it's been distilled down, but it often does capture something it's believable the writer would have said. For example, I do think I may have been caught out by this last episode. Joan Didion said lots of interesting things about writing, but I haven't been able to work out if she said the exact phrase, "We are the stories we tell ourselves." She did write in the White Album that, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live. We look for the sermon in the suicide, for the social or moral lesson in the murder of 5. We interpret what we see, select the most workable of the multiple choices. We live entirely, especially if we are writers, by the imposition of a narrative line upon disparate images, by the ideas with which we have learned to freeze the shifting phantasmagoria which is our actual experience. Which is not far off the sentiment, we are the stories we tell ourselves, but definitely not such a distilled, pithy phrase. I expect it went through several iterations and possibly several people to become the short quote. But the idea is there. And as an aside, it's also a great summary of what I'm trying to get at with this podcast. So to bring it back to facts and fiction, I think sometimes fiction can do a similar thing to the process some of these quotes go through. It can take an idea, an experience, or a messy, complicated reality and distill it down to its key essence and bring that story to the front. Not always, of course, and especially not when dealing with truths which are stranger than fiction. But when truths are hard, messy, or unpalatable, sometimes fiction can bring those truths home. One example of this, which came up in several of the lists of books which changed the world, is The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. For anyone not familiar, The Jungle is a fiction novel set in the Packingtown slaughterhouse and meatpacking district of Chicago in 1904. It tells the story of Quercus, a Lithuanian migrant who moves to the US in the hope of a better life. So to write this book, Upton Sinclair moved to Packingtown for several weeks. He was a young socialist and he wanted to make a difference. So he took himself to Packingtown, interviewed workers, went into factories, and spoke to doctors and police as well. And then he distilled all of this down into a work of fiction. The book's unflinching in its depiction of the conditions in the slaughterhouses and meatpacking factories and goes into great detail about the rancid meat, rats, rat poison that makes its way into sausages, and the diseased cattle being processed alongside other meat. Upton Sinclair wrote the story to try and make the working conditions in these places visible and drive reform. His characters suffer workplace injuries and deal with low pay and dangerous conditions. They're defrauded by a real estate agent and Quercus struggles to find work and pay his bills. However, as Sinclair put it at the time, I aimed for the public's heart and by accident I hit it in the stomach. End quote. As you can see from this, the reaction to the book was more about the disgusting conditions in the meat district than the labour conditions. While I understand the hope about improving labour conditions, I do understand the disgust too. For one example of a quote from the book, "They had set him to cleaning out the traps, and the family sat around and listened in wonder while he told them what that meant. It seemed that he was working in the room where the men prepared the beef for canning, and the beef had lain in vats full of chemicals, and men with great forks speared it out and dumped it into the trucks to be taken to the cooking room. When they had speared out all they could reach, they emptied the vat on the floor and then, with shovels, scraped up the balance and dumped it into the truck. This floor was filthy, yet they set Antanas with his mop, slopping the pickle into a hole that connected with a sink where it was caught and used over again forever. And if that was not enough, there was a trap in the pipe where all the scraps of meat and odds and ends of refuse were caught, and every few days it was the old man's task to clean these out and shovel their contents into one of the trucks with the rest of the meat." End quote. The details in the book attracted a lot of attention, and Sinclair ended up in correspondence with President Theodore Roosevelt. The president, not trusting Sinclair, ordered his own investigation. Despite the president's inspectors not being anonymous, their investigation did substantiate at least some of the allegations in the book. The reaction to these revelations led to the 1906 Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, or at least it's the way that it is often taught. As so often happens with the stories I look at in this show, It's more complex than the headlines. In this case, the Food and Drug Act had been considered for years, and the Meat Inspection Act was also being planned. However, both were facing stiff opposition from businesses, and little progress was being made. The jungle and the public response to it did make it easier to get the laws passed, but it wasn't solely responsible. It was part of a much broader campaign about food quality. Interestingly, the law actually functioned in the meatpacking company's favour more than that of the workers. The company knew they weren't trusted and that regulation would help their reputation. In lobbying against the bill, they managed to get the federal government to pay for the inspections rather than the meatpacking companies. Sinclair was initially very disappointed that the focus was on the food quality, but over time, he grew to appreciate the impact his work has had. I think it's something else worth noting while we're talking about books being part of bigger picture campaigns. While The Jungle isn't directly linked to improvements in labour standards, the socialist and union movements in the early 20th century did slowly improve things for workers. And I expect all the stories of terrible work conditions, such as those in The Jungle, were part of the bigger picture of these campaigns too. I had intended for this episode to focus on fiction and history. However, with news that the US is pausing milk inspections and stopping an effort to reduce the salmonella in raw chicken, the story in The Jungle and the story of food standards campaigns is once again timely. The FDA was started for a reason, to regulate food standards and to stop people, even rich ones who bought the most expensive milk, from being poisoned by additives and bacteria. I just hope it doesn't take another scandal on the level of the response to The Jungle to maintain and improve food standards in the US. Another small tangent I went on while researching was around claims of an uncensored edition of The Jungle. The story was initially serialised in a socialist magazine called Appeal to Reason. Sinclair then tried to find a publisher. He was turned down by several, but finally convinced Doubleday, Page and Company to publish it after they had verified the claims he made in the book. As part of the process of collating and publishing it, Sinclair rewrote and edited the manuscript. The so-called uncensored edition is based on the Appeal to Reason serial. It's easy to believe that the book may have been censored, given the content, but it's not really true. It's just the normal editing process. It's a great example of how stories of conspiracies can start. There's an element of truth. There were earlier versions, and it was a controversial book, which tends to attract censorship. However, here at least, the reality is much simpler. It wasn't censored. It was just an earlier version. So, overall, The Jungle by itself didn't change the world, but I think it does deserve a place on the list of books that have contributed to change. Another author who features often on these lists and who wrote about social conditions in his novels was Charles Dickens. The line between his writing and outcomes is not as clear as with The Jungle, but he definitely brought the realities of being poor in Victorian England into the sitting rooms of people who might otherwise have ignored it. Oliver Twist is probably the most famous example. In it, he shows the treatment of poor people in workhouses through the portrayal of Oliver's treatment there and the consequences he faces when daring to ask for some more food. The novel also includes descriptions of the rules set down by the board of the workhouse. To quote, "So they established the rule that all poor people should have the alternative, for they would compel nobody, not they, of being starved by a gradual process in the house or by a quick one out of it. With this view, they contracted with the waterworks to lay on an unlimited supply of water, with a corn factory to supply periodically a small quantities of oatmeal, and issued 3 meals of thin gruel a day, with an onion twice weekly and half a roll on Sundays." End quote. The most famous line of the book, which has made its way into the musical and various other adaptations, is of course, "Please, sir, can I have some more?" It comes from a passage making it clear how deficient the rations in the workhouse were. The consequences: that Oliver was removed from the workhouse and basically sold as a an apprentice were dire, despite him asking for such a small thing as enough food to survive. Dickens' other stories often touched on similar themes. His father spent time in a debtor's prison, and it is thought to have inspired some of his later work depicting the treatment of the poor. In his writing, he gave poor people names, personalities, and characters, and demonstrated the conditions they lived in despite their best efforts. Some of the influential books lists make a lot of this. When I started planning this episode, I thought I would find this supplemented by many articles about how much influence Dickens had had. However, it turns out this wasn't really the case. Dickens scholars haven't traced any direct impact of the books on reform. However, they do think his work influenced debate by portraying realities of workhouses and juvenile crime. Indeed, there was apparently an uproar when one of the areas depicted in Oliver Twist was discovered to be a real place in London and not just a work of fiction. So it's interesting that both of these books, which turn up on Penguin's lists of books which have changed the world, have more nuanced stories than the headlines. Dickens' work affected public sentiment, but didn't drive direct reform. Sinclair's book did lead to changes, but not quite the ones he was aiming for. The skeptic in me notes that Penguin publishes editions of both of these books, which are linked from the article, so perhaps that was one of the reasons they were included. So while fiction stories can tell the truth about the world we live in, the stories of how those books impact the world are similarly nuanced. To go back to the book about books my parents gave me for graduation, it didn't include Oliver Twist or The Jungle, but it did include another book by Charles Dickens, and that was A Christmas Carol. And it is probably the book of his that has had the most impact on the world, although again, maybe not in the way you think. If you're not familiar with it, A Christmas Carol is the tale of a miserly old man named Ebenezer Scrooge, who is confronted with his cruelty and the poverty of his employee through being haunted by three spirits on Christmas Eve. He changes for the better and becomes generous. If you haven't read the book, you may have seen the Muppets adaptation, which does stay very close to the text in a lot of ways. The story touches on some of the same issues as Oliver Twist, the precariousness of poverty and the divide between rich and poor. Indeed, it picks up on one issue in particular which was important at the time. This doesn't make it into most of the adaptations, but it is mentioned in the book. This was a system where poor households would have their Sunday and Christmas meals cooked in local bakeries. At the time A Christmas Carol was being published, there was a change planned in the law to force bakeries to close completely, no longer allowing the practice. This in turn would have stopped families having a roast for Christmas. Thankfully, the practice wasn't banned. In fact, in London, it continued at least into the First World War period. My great-grandmother managed to burn her roast by leaving a bone-handled knife in with the stuffing, where it smouldered and sadly ruined the meat. As bakers' ovens were much hotter than what people had to cook at home, this was not an isolated incident. In fact, the Walker's factory in Scotland was still cooking festive roasts for people in the 80s. This also came along with the occasional burned roast. So that tangent just brings home to me how recent some of these stories are and how connected we are to them still. But back to A Christmas Carol. The story depicts the reality of being poor in Victorian London, and that even with Bob Cratchit working as a clerk, he struggled to support his family. However, as mentioned with Oliver Twist, this sadly didn't lead to much in the way of immediate social change. It didn't soften the hearts of the real Ebenezer Scrooges of the world either. However, what it did do was save Christmas. Okay, help to save Christmas. The celebration of Christmas was becoming less popular as the Industrial Revolution brought more and more people into the cities. There were various efforts made to sustain it, including Prince Albert setting up England's first Christmas tree, a tradition he brought over from his native Germany. However, A Christmas Carol gets a lot of credit for increasing the popularity of the holiday. Dickens may also be responsible for the idea of a white Christmas. They're usually pretty rare in England, especially in the southeast. But there were few unusually cold winters when Dickens was a child, which may have inspired snow in his Christmas stories. In other words, it wasn't so much the story A Christmas Carol as the setting which has had an impact on the world. Of course, it had to be an engaging and popular story to achieve that, so in that way the story is still part of the impact. However, I think it's another example of how there's nuance in how books and stories can change the world. This got me thinking about other ways that fiction can change the world as part of bigger picture movements. The most obvious is probably the various obscenity trials about books. The books become catalysts for social movements, more for the type of content than for the exact story. One example is Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence. It is a story that shocked people when it was released, not just for the sex and the use of various expletives, but for the relationship between the aristocratic Lady Chatterley and her working-class groundskeeper. I've read Lady Chatterley's Lover. It was some years ago, but I remember finding it fairly mild. I guess times have changed, but it wasn't really that shocking. To me, it wasn't even really about sex. It was a fairly good portrayal of depression, which was the main thing I noticed, but maybe that says more about me than the book. Anyway, Lawrence published the book privately in 1928, but it wasn't until 1959 that the ban ended in the US. The following year, Penguin published it in the UK. The resulting trial had some interesting moments that hinted at the changing times. The prosecutor asked the jury, "Would you approve of your young sons, young daughters, because girls can read as well as boys, reading this book? Is it a book you would have lying around your own home? Is it a book that you would even wish your wife or your servants to read?" Unsurprisingly, this drew laughter in the courtroom. I mean, it's nice he acknowledged that girls can read, but the mention of servants didn't go down well in 1960. And it does show how out of touch they were. Though interestingly, the obscenity law at the time did have an exemption for literary merit, which sets off a whole other set of arguments, which might be a future episode. But to bring it back around to quotes about truth in fiction, I found it interesting how hard it was to find sources for this episode. It turns out that everyone knows the jungle led to food quality reforms, but good write-ups were surprisingly hard to find. I think that probably had more to do with the state of search engines these days, along with the proliferation of sample essay sites. I did eventually find a couple of academic journals, but it was a struggle, even more so for Dickens. It's definitely times like these I miss being a student with access to a good library with online journals. I also did a few random searches, including one about fiction impacting the real world. One of the first hits was a site that was either badly translated or written by an AI. It included a reference to a book called The Disdain You Give, which I think was meant to be The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. Definitely a book I'd like to explore in a future episode, but I'm a bit bewildered that this site in particular was one of the first that came up from a fairly generic search. Definitely a tangent for another future episode. The struggle to find good stories among the slush. Seems at the moment that stories optimised for search engines are not necessarily optimised for quality. There were also lots of sites which had interesting insights, but no references or context for who was writing it and where they got their information. As a random person generating content on the internet, I don't begrudge other random people generating content on the internet, but please cite your sources. It gives me some way to assess what you're saying. I do try to do that, at least. Which takes me to my usual reminder that the sources are all on the website, ourstoriesandourselves.com. But to pull all of these threads together, since I haven't really done a narrative arc for this episode about stories of stories, there are lots of different ways that stories affect reality. They can take reality in all of its messy glory and distill it down to a key point, much as the quotes I opened this episode with do. Both The Jungle and Oliver Twist do this in their own way by portraying the reality of poverty in specific characters rather than just as impersonal descriptions. The stories introduce characters who give names, personalities to the experiences, as well as depicting the conditions. Stories can also have less direct effects on reality. They can introduce or popularise settings, and of course, they can become a catalyst for challenging obscenity laws and censorship. However, as with most narratives I've talked about, it's complex and usually part of a bigger picture, not just a simple story of one book changing the world, as much fun as that would be. So, thank you so much for listening. If you have thoughts, drop me an email at ourstoriesandourselves@gmail.com or on Blue Sky, ourstories.bluesky.social, and do suggest topics or interviews and stories that you think I should look into. As usual, feed the algorithm with likes, reviews, and subscriptions, or tell your friends. We've had a few quotes today, but to close, one more from Charles Dickens, this one from the novel David Copperfield. To quote, "It was as true," said Mr. Barkis, "as turnips is." "It was as true," said Mr. Barkis, nodding his nightcap, which was his only means of emphasis, "as taxes is, and nothing's truer than them."